Hey everyone. This is a piece that I found. I was like scrolling through WorldCat, and I looked up Maximilien Rubel, because a lot of it isn't translated into English, but he's a really prolific writer. Um, but I found that he had a chapter in this book from the '60s titled "Revolutionary Russia," edited by Richard Pipes. You don't know who Richard Pipes is? I think he was like one of like the like Cold Warish historians of the Russian Revolution. Um, yeah, he had it says Richard Pipes, uh, who lived from 1923 to 2018, was an American historian who specialized in Russian and Soviet history. Pipes was a frequent interviewee in the press on matters of Soviet history and foreign affairs. Richard Pipes' writings also appear in commentary of the New York Times and the Times Literary Supplement. At Harvard University, Pipes taught large courses on Imperial Russia and as well as the Russian Revolution, and guided over 80 graduate students to their PhDs. In 1976, Pipes headed Team B, a team of analysts organized by the Central Intelligence Agency who analyzed the strategic capacities and goals of the Soviet military and political leadership. Pipes is the father of American historian Daniel Pipes. So, like, Richard Pipes is like a big historian. But he edited a volume titled "Revolutionary Russia" that had a bunch of different people in it. One of those people is Maximilien Rubel. And if you don't know who Maximilien Rubel is, I have pieces from him on the channel. But Maximilien Rubel was like a libertarian uh, Marxologist in France. Um, he was friends with he was kind of like he was in the council communist milieu of France. Wikipedia says Maximilien Rubel, who lived from 1905 to 1996, was an Austrian Marxist historian, humanist, and council communist. Paresh Chattopadhyay, who I've had a few pieces up from him, dedicated his book Socialism and Commodity Production to Maximilien Rubel. There's a biography, like a little, like, no, not a biography, but like an obituary from Maximilien Rubel by Kevin B. Anderson of Marxist humanist fame. Um, but yeah, I'm gonna read that soon. But anyway, let me read this thing. It's titled "The Relationship of Bolshevism to Marxism." My subject, the relationship of Bolshevism to Marxism, can be understood in three ways. One, as the study of the relationship of Bolshevism and Bolshevism's various factions to the other Russian Marxist currents, for instance, the so-called legal Marxism and Menshevism. Two, as the confrontation of Bolshevism with Western Marxism, as it evolved from the intellectual heritage of the founders of, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, and three, as the examination of the relationship of Bolshevism to, quote, original Marxism, end quote, that is, the teachings of Marx and Engels. Although I shall concentrate on this last topic, I will have to deal, at least in passing, with the two others as well. Let me proceed to the central topic of my paper. Did the Bolsheviks in 1917 act in accordance with the social theory of Marx and Engels? In order to answer this question, we must define Marx's theory and compare it not only with Bolshevik Marxism, as revealed mainly in Lenin's theoretical writings, but also with the policies followed by the Bolshevik Party in 1917. In my view, the theoretical position taken by Marx and Engels with respect to the social future of Tsarist Russia is a perfect illustration of their general conception of historical evolution. For this reason, it may be useful to begin by recalling their attitudes toward Russia, attitudes strongly influenced by a burning hatred of autocracy, of which Tsarist Russia was then the most advanced example, as compared to Prussian monarchism and French Bonapartism. Marx was almost pathological in his distrust of Russians, a fact that did not prevent Russian liberals and revolutionaries alike, as he later complained, from singling him out for special attention. One of the things that I noticed, one of the things I remember, there's like a talk by Marcelo Musto, who's like one of the top, I would say probably one of the top Marx scholars in the game right now. and he edited the Marx Engels Marxism book series, and he's put together some awesome compendiums. But he said that he seconds this. I don't know if he would quote as far as to say almost pathological, but he would say like a very, very strong part of Marx's journalistic writings is an extreme distrust of Tsarist Russia, extreme opposition to Russia and their role in like international politics. I remember him saying that. During a quarter of a century, Marx never ceased to warn about Russia's messianic striving for world domination. In 1865 to 57, Marx had published in the Free Press the journal of the notorious Russophobe David Urquhart, a historical study written in purest David Urquhartian style. Let's see who David Urquhart is. David Urquhart Jr. was a Scottish diplomat, writer, and politician serving as a member of Parliament from 1847 to 1852. He was also an early promoter of the Turkish bath in the United Kingdom. So that's who David Urquhart is, or at least the best I can find on him. To sum up the essential elements of his work, let me actually see something real quick. Okay, never mind. Back to the text. To sum up the essential elements of this work, Revelations of the Diplomatic History of the 18th Century, one could do no better than cite some of Marx's own comments on Russia's early and modern history. Quote, "The bloody mire of Mongolian slavery, not the rude glory of the Norman epoch, forms the cradle of Muscovy. And modern Russia is but a metamorphosis of Muscovy. It was Ivan Katila, the Mongolian slave, who elaborated all the cunning of the most abject slavery into a system, and his policy remained the policy of Ivan the Great, as well as of Peter the Great. Peter the Great, the creator of modern Russia, divested the old Muscovite system of encroachment of its purely local character, and generalized its purpose by exalting its object, which is unlimited power. Modern Russia's drive for Constantinople is but the continuation of the policy of the Rurik dynasty, which transformed its capital by Novgorod to Kiev, transferred its capital from Novgorod to Kiev in order to be nearer to Byzantium. Byzantium became the model of Russian religion and civilization, as well as the aim of Russia's everlasting aspirations." I want to look some of these things up real quick, so sorry. Ivan Katila is Ivan Katila is Ivan the First of Moscow. He lived from 1288 to 1340 or 1341, as Prince of Moscow from 1325 to at least 1340. The grandparents Prince of Vladimir from 1332 until at least 1340. I also wanted. What else? I want to look. The Rurik dynasty. What the hell is that? As you can probably tell, my knowledge of a lot of things that aren't like immediate history are pretty limited. It says the Rurik dynasty, also known as the Rurikid or Ryurikid dynasty, as well as the Rurikids or Ryurikids, was a noble lineage allegedly founded by the Varangian prince Rurik, who, according to tradition, established himself at Novgorod in the year 862. The Rurikids were the ruling dynasty of Kievan Rus and its principalities following its disintegration. The Romanovici ruled the southwestern territories, which were unified by Roman the Great and his son Daniel, who was in 1253 crowned by Pope Innocent IV as the king of Ruthenia. Galicia, Volhynia was eventually annexed by Poland and Lithuania. The northern and northeastern territories were unified by the Danilovici of Moscow. By the 15th century, Ivan III threw off the control of the Golden Horde and assumed the title of sovereign of all of Russia. Ivan IV was crowned as the Tsar of all Russia, where the Rurik line ruled until 1598, following which they were eventually succeeded by the House of Romanov. As a ruling house, the Rurikids, I don't know how to say it, Rurikids or Rurikids, I don't know, held their own for a total of 21 generations in male line succession, from Rurik 879 to Fyodor I of Russia, who died in 1598, a period of more than 700 years. Numerous princely families have claimed to trace their lineage to Rurik. They are one of Europe's oldest royal houses, with numerous existing cadet branches. Okay, so that's all I wanted to look up. That's the end of the Marx quote, so back to the text. In a more positive vein, Marx saw the beginning of a social revolution in Russia in the emancipation of the peasants after the Crimean War and in Tsarist policy towards the peasantry in the 1860s. But it was only when he came into contact with Russian revolutionaries that his attention turned seriously towards Russian economic and social problems. Could this nation escape the destiny of Western Europe, capitalism, private ownership, the bourgeois state? Could it perform the fundamental task of creating a new society founded on communal property and cooperative production of the peasant commune, the Obstchina? The Obstchina, according to Wikipedia, or Mir, I mean, I'm sure you all know what the Mir is, but literally rural community, official term in the 19th and 20th century, literally were peasant village communities as opposed to individual farmsteads or coutures in Imperial Russia. The term derived from the word obshchi, Russian for common. The Mir was a community consisting of former serfs or state peasants and their descendants, settled as a rule in a single village, although sometimes a village included more than one mir, and conversely several villages were sometimes combined in a single mir. The title of the land was vested in the mir and not in the individual peasant. Members of the mir had the right to the allotment on some uniform basis as a holding that each member cultivated separately. A holding could not be sold or bequeathed without the consent of the mir. As a consequence of its collective tenure, the mir had the power to repartition the land from time to time among its constituent households. The mir dealt primarily with the household and not with the individual. The peasants had a right to a holding, but not to a particular holding, and he could not dispose of it freely. The vast majority of Russian peasants held their land in communal ownership within a mir community, which acted as a village government and a cooperative. Arable land was divided in sections based on soil quality and distance from the village. Each household had the right to claim one or more strips of each section, depending on the number of adults in the household. The purpose of this allocation was not so much social, to each according to his needs, as it was practical, that each person pay his taxes. Strips were periodically reallocated on the basis of a census to ensure equitable share of the land. This was enforced by the state, which had an interest in the ability of households to pay their taxes. So, that's the Obstchina. Back to the text. Back to the text. Stimulated by the economist N.F. Danielson, who translated Capital, Marx immersed himself in the study of archaic and Asiatic forms of property holding. Marx concluded an agreement with the populace that under certain conditions the Russian peasant commune offered a possible starting point for the coming social and socialist revolution in Russia, enabling the country to bypass the capitalist stage of development. At Marx's urging, the 1875 at Marx's urging in 1875, Engels published an answer to the criticism of P. Tkachev, a Russian follower of Auguste Blanqui. Wikipedia says Peter Tkachev was a Russian writer who lived from 1844 to 1886. He was a critic and revolutionary theorist who formulated many of the revolutionary principles that were later developed and put into action by Vladimir Lenin. Although Tkachev is sometimes described as, quote, the first Bolshevik, end quote, he did not figure prominently in the mythology of the Soviet Union. It says, historian Andrei Valisky argued that the form of economic determinism espoused by Tkachev differed significantly from the historical materialism developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, stating that, quote, this specific, quote, economic materialism, end quote, of Tkachev did not amount to Marxism. This economic determinism constituted rather a peculiar mixture of some elements of Marxism with a rather primitive utilitarianism, grossly exaggerating the role of direct economic motivation in individual behavior, end quote. So much for Tkachev. Back to the text. In an open letter to Engels, Tkachev had reproached him for his ignorance of Russian social conditions and revolutionary prospects. According to Tkachev, Russia was the chosen land of socialism because Russia had neither a bourgeoisie nor a proletariat, but was based instead on communal institutions such as the artel and the mir. What is the artel? Wikipedia says an artel was any of the several types of cooperative associations and later corporate enterprises in the Tsardom of Russia, the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union. The artel began centuries ago, but were especially prevalent from the time of the emancipation of the serfs in 1861 through the 1950s. In the later Soviet period, 1960s to the 1980s, the term was mostly phased out with the complete monopolization of the Soviet economy by the state. So, back to the text. There remained, however, the political problem, the overthrow of Tsarism, and the conquest of the state by a revolutionary minority. Here, very briefly, is Engels' answer. A social revolution is certainly brewing in Russia, but the social revolution in Russia will not have a socialist character because of the absence of a strong urban proletariat and of a powerful capitalist bourgeoisie. In other words, because of the insufficient development of Russia's productive forces, which requires both capital and a bourgeoisie. According to Engels, there is no doubt that the presence in Russia of communal forms of labor and property demonstrated the deep desire of the Russian people for a cooperative mode of production, but it did not in the least prove its messianic drive for socialism nor its independence of Western movements. Although it was menaced by the progress of capitalism, the mir could become the basis of Russian socialism. The mir could help this function only on one condition: the previous triumph of the proletarian revolution in Western Europe. Until that time, Russian and the European Revolution must mobilize all popular forces to overthrow Tsarism. Two years later, Marx himself entered the discussion, answering the Russian publicist N.K. Mikhailovsky, who had criticized his, quote, philosophical system, end quote, for presenting capitalism as an inevitable stage that no country could avoid. Marx objected to this improper interpretation of his thought. He asserted that his explanation of Western capitalism did not by any means claim to be a, quote, historical and philosophical theory of the general advance necessarily imposed upon all peoples, end quote. Historical understanding could be obtained only by an empirical and comprehensive analysis of the evidence, and not by a particular and philosophical theory, quote, the supreme virtue of which is to be supra-historical, end quote. As for Russia's social future and the hopes that populists placed in the rural commune, Marx expressed the following opinion based, as he wrote, on a long study of Russian and other documentary materials. Quote, if Russia continues to pursue the path Russia has followed since 1861, Russia will lose the finest chance ever offered by history to a people and undergo all the fatal vicissitudes of a capitalist regime, ... If Russia is tending to become a capitalist nation after the example of the West European countries, and during the last few years Russia has been taking a lot of trouble in this direction, she will not succeed without having first transformed a good part of her peasants into proletarians, and after that, once taken into the bosom of the capitalist regime, she'll experience its pitiless laws like other profane peoples. End quote. Marx. That's from a piece titled Marx to the Editorial Board of the Otechestvenia Zabitsky. I think that was a, I don't know. I don't want to say. Maybe, I think it's a Russian populist journal. I've looked it up when I was doing like some of the readings from James D. White's Russia and Marx, or Marx and Russia, which talks about these kind of like debates. Anyway, back to the text, or end footnote, or whatever. I'm reading again. Marx retained his sympathy for the populist aspirations until his death, even after serious theoretical and political disagreements had developed between them and the first Russian Marxists. Marx spoke sarcastically of those Russian revolutionaries, quote, who left Russia voluntarily and, ... in order to carry on propaganda in Russia, moved to Geneva. What a quid pro quo. These gentlemen are against all political revolutionary action. Russia is to make a somersault into the anarchist, communist, atheist millennium. Meanwhile, they are preparing for this leap with the most tedious doctrinarism, whose so-called principles are being hawked about the street ever since the late Bakunin. End quote. Marx. That's from Marx to F.A., a letter to F.A. Zorga from November 5th, 1880. It must be noted that this criticism by Marx was directed against the Russian socialists in Geneva, grouped around the journal Chernaya Peredel, the Black Repetition, after the split of the Narodnaya Volia, People's Will. G. Plekhanov, P.B. Axelrod, and Feris Asulich, who would soon become the, quote, Nestors, end quote, of Russian Marxism, belonged to this group. Marx considered them, quote, anarchists and utopians, while admiring the terrorist faction of Narodnaya Volia, whose members were risking their lives in Russia against Tsarism. I don't know what the Nestors means. Marx considered them, quote, anarchists and utopians, while admiring the terrorist faction of the Narodnaya Volia, whose members were risking their lives in Russia against Tsarism. Before Feris Asulich's flight to Geneva, Feris Asulich had made an attempt on the life of the prefect of St. Petersburg and had been acquitted by a jury. Feris Asulich joined the Cherny Peredeltsi in Geneva, and from there, in February 1881, she addressed a letter to Marx in the name of her group in which she asked his opinion on a major political disagreement among the Russian revolutionaries, for whom it was, quote, a matter of life and death, end quote. Either the rural commune would be able to develop in a socialist direction, in which case the revolutionaries should devote all their forces to the emancipation and development of the commune, or it was meant to disappear, leaving the Russian socialists to speculate on the swiftness of Russia's capitalist development and restricting their activity to propaganda among the city workers. Feris Asulich asserted that the second thesis was that of the, quote, Marxist, end quote. But was it that of Marx himself? Marx tried to outline his views in several drafts that contain a tentative sociological analysis of the institution of the Obsthina. Because he confined himself to a short answer, we may assume that his illness prevented him from completing his project. He was to die 2 years later, rejecting the idea of the, quote, historical necessity, end quote, of capitalism for all the countries of the world. Marx declared in his answer to Ferris Asulich, quote, "The analysis developed in Capital, the book, gives reasons neither in favor of nor against the vitality of the Russian Commune, but a special study I made on it, searching for the materials in the original sources, convinced me that this Commune is the basis of Russia's social regeneration. But so that it may act as such, the deleterious influences which assault it on all sides should first be eliminated, and then the normal conditions of a spontaneous development should be guaranteed it." End quote. Marx. With this interpretation, Marx decided against his Russian disciples, that is, against those Marxists who no longer accepted any alternative to the development of capitalism in Russia. Capitalism in Russia was for him only one possibility. Socialism could develop either through the peasant commune or through capitalism. About a year after his answer to Ferris Asulich, he signed with Engels the preface to a Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, in which the following statement appears, quote, "If the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a workers' revolution in the West, so that both revolutions complete each other, the present Russian commune property can become the starting point of a communist revolution." End quote. After Marx's death, Engels continued the discussion with the Russian populists and Marxists without, however, risking a definite judgment that would have decided in favor of either group. It is no exaggeration to say that the views expressed by Engels in the early intellectual manifestations of Russian Marxism are a thorough criticism, if not a condemnation, of the political strategy advocated by the first Russian followers of Marx, as well as of all political tactics adopted after his death by the new generation of Russian Marxists. Given the relevance of Engels' statements and the almost complete silence with which contemporary Marxists treat it, particularly in the quote socialist end quote countries, it's necessary to quote some essential passages. The following is from a letter by H.L. Lopatin, Lopatin, written a few months after the death of Marx, in which Lopatin reports a conversation with Engels. I can't find anything for H.A. Lopatin. Quote, "We spoke a lot about Russian affairs, of the probable course of our political and social rebirth, ... Engels also thinks, as do Marx and I, that the task of a revolutionary party or party of action in Russia at present is not to propagate a new socialist ideal or even to strive to carry out that ideal, which as yet is far from being completely elaborated, with the help of a provisional government consisting of our comrades. It must be to direct all efforts, either 1, to force the Tsar to convoke a Zemsky Sobor, or 2, by intimidating the Tsar, and so forth, stir up profound disturbances, which would lead in another way to the convocation of a Sobor, or something of the kind." The Zemsky Sobor, according to Wikipedia, Zemsky Sobor was a parliament of the Tsardom of Russia's estates of the realm, active during the 16th and 17th centuries. The assembly represented Russia's feudal classes in 3 categories: nobility and the high bureaucracy, the Holy Sobor of the Orthodox clergy, and representatives of, quote, commoners, end quote, including merchants and townspeople. Assemblies could be summoned either by the Tsar, the Patriarch, or the Boyar Duma to decide current agenda, controversial issues, or enact major pieces of legislation. So that's the Zemsky Sobor. I'm trying to figure out. He says he thinks, and I think he is again referring to Engels, as I do, that such a Sobor would inevitably lead to a radical and not only political but also social reorganization. Engels believes in the immense significance of the electoral period in the sense of the far greater success of propaganda than all booklets and oral information. He considers a purely liberal constitution impossible without profane economic reorganization and therefore is not afraid of the danger of that. He believes that in the actual conditions of the life of the people, enough material for a reorganization of society on a new basis has accumulated. He naturally does not believe in the instant implementation of communism or anything like it, but only of what has already matured in the life and soul of the people. He believes that the people will manage to find eloquent spokesmen to voice their needs, desires, etc. He believes that once this reorganization or revolution is started, no force will be capable of stopping it. Hence, one thing alone is important: to shatter the fatal forces of inertia, to get the people in society to shake off their sluggishness and inertness, and to bring about disturbances which will force the government and the people to set about the interior reorganization, stir the placid ocean of the people, and arouse the attention and enthusiasm of the whole nation of a complete social upheaval. The results will come of themselves, whatever results are possible, desirable, and realizable for the epoch in question. All this is drastically summarized, but I cannot go into details now, and then perhaps you will not like it at all. That is why I am giving you word for word other opinions of Engels which are very flattering for the Russian Revolutionary Party. They are, quote, "All depends now on what is done in the immediate future in Petersburg, on which are now fixed the eyes of all thinking, far-sighted, and penetrating people in the whole of Europe," end quote. Quote, Russia is the France of the Russia is the France of the present century. To her belongs rightfully and lawfully the revolutionary initiative of a new social reorganization. End quote. End quote. H.A. Lobatin, from a letter to N.M. Ashanina, September 20th, 1883, first published in Fundamentals of Theoretical Socialism and Their Application to Russia, published in Geneva, 1893, translated from the Russian in Reminiscences of Marx and Engels. In February 1885, Ferenc Sasulich addressed a letter to Engels asking him his opinion of Plekhanov's book, Nashi Raznoglazia, Our Differences. In his answer, Engels declared that he had read only the first 60 pages of the book, but that this was enough to acquaint him, quote, more or less with the differences in question, end quote. Then Engels wrote, quote, "First of all, I repeat to you that I am proud to know that there is a party among the youth of Russia which frankly and without equivocation accepts the great economic and historical theories of Marx, and is decisively broken with all the anarchist and more or less Slavophile traditions of its predecessors. And Marx himself would have been equally proud of this had he lived a little longer. It is an advance which will be of great importance for the revolutionary development of Russia. To me, the historical theory of Marx is the fundamental condition of all reasoned and consistent revolutionary tactics. To discover these reasoned and consistent revolutionary tactics, one has to apply the theory to the economic and political conditions of the country in question, ... What I know or believe I know about the situation in Russia makes me think that the Russians are approaching their 1789. The revolution must break out there in a limited period of time. It may break out any day. In these circumstances, the country is like a charged mine which only needs a match to be applied to it, especially since March 13. March 1st, 1881, occurred the assassination of Alexander II. End footnote. This is one of the exceptional cases where it is possible for a handful of people to make a revolution, i.e. one little push to cause a whole system, which, to use a metaphor of Plekhanov's, is in more than liable more than labile equilibrium, to come crashing down and thus by an action in itself insignificant, to release explosive forces that afterwards become uncontrollable. Well now, if ever Blanchism, the fantastic idea of overturning an entire society by the action of a small conspiracy, had a certain raison d'etre, that is certainly so now in Petersburg. Once the spark has been put to the powder, once the forces have been released and national energy has been transformed from potential into kinetic, another favorite image of Plekhanov's and a very good one, the people who laid the spark to the mine will be swept away by the explosion, which will be 1,000 times as strong as they themselves, ... Suppose the people imagine they can seize power, what does it matter, provided they make the hole which will shatter the dike? The flood itself will soon rob them of their illusions. But if by chance these illusions resulted in giving them a superior force of will, why complain of that? People who boast that they made a revolution always see the day after that they had no idea what they were doing, that the revolution made does not in the least resemble the revolution they would have liked to make. ... To me, the important thing is that the impulse in Russia should be given, that the revolution should break out. Whether this faction or that faction gives the signal, whether it happens under this flag or that, matters little to me. If it were a palace conspiracy, it would be swept away tomorrow. There where the situation is so strained, where the revolutionary elements have accumulated to such a degree, where the economic conditions of the enormous mass of the people become daily more impossible, ... Where all these contradictions are violently held in check by an unexampled despotism, ... When 1789 has once been launched, 1793 will not be long in following. End quote. Engels. In a conversation with Kautsky, Engels once more commented on Plekhanov's writing. We quote from a letter of Kautsky to Bernstein. Engels is presently reading Plekhanov's latest brochure. Engels finds it very interesting, by and large theoretically correct, and in some passages really excellent. Coming from Engels, this certainly is high praise, but much as Engels likes the pamphlet with regard to theory, Engels finds its tactical remarks, I do not wish to say false, but not very well to the point. What matters today in Russia, Engels says, is not a program but the revolution. If it comes to that, however, the liberals and not the socialists will come to power. Only if under the impact of this revolution, the socialist revolution will be victorious in Western Europe, this victory can have an effect on Russia and help to bring socialism to the top. Those people who will make the revolution in Russia will not go on leading it. Their theoretical vision is not as important as their energy. Today one has to unite in Russia the energetic elements for common action, regardless of differences in their program, and Plekhanov is wrong in attacking the only people who right now are doing something in Russia, the Narodnaya Volya, even if his position towards them is theoretically correct. What matters at this time in Russia is the fall of Tsarism and the unification of all elements for this purpose, and Engels will always place himself at the side of those who act accordingly, even though their programs are incomplete. End quote. Kautsky to Bernstein, June 30th, 1885. Of particular interest are the ideas expressed by Engels on Russia's capitalistic future in his letters to Danielson, who firmly retained his populist hopes in the future of the Obshchina. Here are excerpts from Engels' letter mentioned above. Quote, this is from June 18th, 1892. Could Russia in the year 1890 have existed and held its own in the world as a purely agricultural country living upon the export of her corn and buying foreign industrial products with it? And there I believe we can safely reply no. A nation of 100 millions that play an important part in the history of the world could not, under the present economic and industrial conditions, continue in the state in which Russia was up to the Crimean War. ... All governments, all governments, be they ever so absolute, are indenier lieu, but the executors of the economic necessities of the national situation. They may do this in various ways, good, bad, and indifferent. They may accelerate or retard the economic development and its political and juridical consequences, but in the long run they must follow it. Whether the means by which the Industrial Revolution has been carried out in Russia have been the best for the purpose is a question by itself in which it would lead too far to discuss. For my purpose, it is sufficient if I can prove that this Industrial Revolution in itself was unavoidable. End quote. Engels. Another letter, October 17, 1893. Quote, in the Berlin Sozialpolitisches Centralblatt, a Mr. P. Struve has a long article on your book. Remember, these are letters to Danielson. I must agree with Struve in this one point, that for me too the present capitalistic phase of development in Russia appears an unavoidable consequence of the historical conditions as created by the Crimean War, the way in which the change of 1861 in agrarian conditions was accomplished, and the political stagnation in Europe generally. Where he is decidedly wrong is in comparing the present state of Russia with that of the United States, in order to refute what he calls your pessimistic views of the future. He says the evil consequences of modern capitalism in Russia will be as easily overcome as they are in the United States. There Struve quite forgets that the United States are modern bourgeois from the very origin. ... Whereas in Russia we have a groundwork of a primitive communistic character, a pre-civilizational Gentilgesellschaft, crumbling ruins. It is true ... The material upon which the capitalistic revolution, for it is a real social revolution, acts and operates ... Therefore it stands to reason that the change in Russia must be far more violent, far more incisive, and accompanied by immensely greater suffering than it can be in America. However, there is no reason to be pessimistic about such a prospect. There is no great historical evil without a compensating historical progress. Only the modus operandi is changed. Que le destinée s'accomplissement. End quote. Engels to N.F. Danielson. Whatever ambiguity is contained in Marx's and Engels' sociological and political teachings, the intellectual legacy they transmitted to the Russian disciples, whether populist or Marxist, was quite unequivocal. They called the populace attention to the fact that the survival and the expansion of the rural commune depended both on the fall of Tsarism and on the proletarian revolution in the West. They advised the Russian Marxists to abandon all ideological sectarianism and to concentrate their activity on a single goal, the mustering of all dynamic elements of Russian society towards the overthrow of Tsarist despotism. In a conversation with a Russian visitor, A. Vodin, Engels recalled Marx's answer to Mikhailovsky and expressed his hope that the achievement of power by social democracy in the West would coincide with the political and agrarian revolution in Russia. To the same visitor, he expressed his discontent with those Marxists, Russian and others, who were bent on selecting quotation from Marx's or from his own writings instead of thinking as Marx would have thought in their place. It's from A. Vodin, Talks with Engels, Reminiscences of Marx and Lenin, from A. Vodin's article. Not Marx and Lenin. What did I say? Reminiscences of Marx and Engels. From A. Vodin's article, At the Dawn of Legal Marxism. End footnote. Okay, so end footnote. Paradoxical as it may seem, Marx and Engels' political legacy to their Russian disciples was to abstain from being, quote, Marxists, end quote, and to act within the framework of the common struggle of all the revolutionary forces aimed at the overthrow of Tsarism. The whole past of the Russian people condemned the latter, even after the fall of Tsarist autocracy, to undergo a long period of material transformation and political education. Marx and Engels' own political careers were the best illustration of a social theory that defined the spontaneous activity, Selbsttätigkeit, of the modern working class as the main force for bringing about a radical change in human relations and institutions. This social theory declared axiomatically that the new political elites, which had had a preponderant role in revolutions occurring in the pre-capitalist class societies, would play but a secondary role in the revolutionary movements of modern times. Socialist consciousness acquired through the revolutionary struggle against the ruling class in the framework of bourgeois liberal institutions was the absolute prerequisite of the conquest of political power in highly developed capitalist countries. Quote, scientific socialism, end quote, means, on the theoretical level, the use of a specific sociological method defined as, quote, materialist, end quote. This method is characterized by two processes. 1. The choice of material standards for defining various types of society. 2. The adoption of a determinist hypothesis in the analysis of social production. A society is typologically and structurally defined by the way in which its members, strata, and classes determine their material life. In turn, the way of life and the mode of production of societies depend on the productive forces at their disposal. The relations between the individuals in a given society can be derived from their position in the process of production. These relations take on the hierarchical form of ruling classes and ruled classes, the ruling classes living on the fruits of the ruled classes' labor. Class domination is embodied in an apparatus of physical, intellectual, and moral constraint destined to maintain the whole society in a dynamic equilibrium that allows and fosters the development of social wealth at the expense of the class of direct producers. This sociological notion of human life and history implies a particular approach toward the scientific explanation of collective behavior. It leaves an important place for all forms of material determinism that contributes to the molding of types of society and at the same time recognizes men's conscious action. Far from underestimating the interference of chance in the destiny of societies, it pays sincere tribute to the collective efforts of individuals struggling to overcome the social restraints and their alienating effects. The question whether the Bolsheviks were, quote, properly, end quote, Marxist, or whether Bolshevism is an aberration of Marxism must be approached on two levels. Did the Bolsheviks conceive of the coming Russian Revolution as a bourgeois revolution? And did the Bolsheviks conduct their political activities in accordance with the advice given by Marx and Engels to their Russian followers? Paradoxical as it may seem, the first question can be answered. And the question was, did the Bolsheviks conceive of the coming Russian Revolution as a bourgeois revolution? Paradoxically as it seemed, the first question can be answered affirmatively in the sense that not only before 1917, but even after their seizure of power, the Bolsheviks thought and acted as bourgeois revolutionaries. To use a Marxist phrase, they were, quote, objectively, end quote, bourgeois. This term applies as well to other factions of Russian social democracy, the Mensheviks. Although the Russian Marxists venerated the proletariat, being at the time distrustful of spontaneous, quote, economic, end quote, actions of Russian factory workers, the Russian Marxists instinctively worshipped capitalism, emphasizing dogmatically the liberating vocation of the capitalist mode of production. In this profoundly ambivalent attitude, one can find the source of Russian Marxism as the political ideology that received full expression in the Bolshevik capture of political power in October 1917. Footnote. See the excellent remarks of the first Russian follower of Marx in Dietrich Geier, Lenin in der russischen Sozialdemokratie, die Arbeiterbewegung im Zarenreich als Organisationsproblem der revolutionären Intelligenz. Although Dietrich Geier admits that the perspective of the Russian Revolution constituted the common basis between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, M. Fansad argues that although he admits that the perspective of the Russian Revolution constituted the common basis between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, M. Fansad argues that the, quote, kinship was more illusory than real, end quote. How Russia is Ruled, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1965. The origins of Russian Marxism have been recently brought into better light owing to a number of pertinent historical studies such as L. Hameson, The Russian Marxists, and The Origins of Bolshevism, published in 1955, J.L.H. Keep, The Rise of Social Democracy in Russia, Oxford, 1963, Richard Pipe's Social Democracy in the St. Petersburg Labor Movement, 1885 to 1897. I'm going to look some of these people up. I hope you don't mind. Sorry, I'm trying to get to German Wikipedia, and it's always a pain in the ass. German Wikipedia tends to have... the translator seems pretty reliable. I mean, it doesn't seem that way with, like, French, but, like, using Google Translate for German seems pretty reliable. Like, the sentences actually make sense, whereas in the French one, it doesn't. So, yeah. I don't know, I'm not really finding anything for Dietrich Geier. I'm seeing some references to his books, but that's it. M. Fansad. It says Merle Fansad who lived from 1907 to 1972, is an American political scientist best known for his work on public administration and is a scholar of the Soviet Union. His books Smolensk under Soviet rule, based on documents captured by the German army during World War II, and How Russia is Ruled, also known as How the Soviet Union is Governed, helped form the basis of American study of the Soviet Union and established Merle Fansad, quote, as a leading political scientist of the Soviet Union, end quote. Fansad is also remembered for his work in the Office of Price Administration and as the director of Harvard University Library. His book, How Russia is Ruled, in 1953, Fansad finished his book, How Russia is Ruled. The book analyzed Soviet governance from the very beginnings of the Soviet Union until the death of Joseph Stalin, which occurred only months prior to the book's release. In How Russia is Governed, Fansad, quote, carefully described and analyzed, end quote, both the theory and practice of public administration in the Soviet Union. Philip Buck wrote that the book was, quote, of great interest to the general reader, end quote, but found that it had less utility for serious scholars, criticizing in particular the lack of details on Soviet economic planning. Writing a political science quarterly, Leo Gurliov presented a generally favorable review of the book, but criticized its lack of detailed analysis of the Soviet propaganda and indoctrination efforts. In 1963, Feinsod released a revised edition of How Russia is Ruled. By that time, the original book was recognized as, quote, one of the most authoritative interpretations of Soviet reality, end quote, and had become very influential among Sovietologists. In the revised edition, Feinsod used new sources of data on the Soviet Union to help expand on many of the themes in the first edition, and devoted more attention to the post-Stalin era. In the revised edition, Feinsod also took into account certain changes in international dynamics, including the increasing role of nuclear weapons, the Sino-Soviet split, and some of the liberalization in the USSR. In 1997, Foreign Affairs named the book on its list of, quote, significant books, end quote, and called How Russia is Ruled, quote, the book that defined the field of Soviet studies, end quote. So, seems like a very important book. The next person is L.M. Hameson. L.H. Hameson. Says L.H. Hameson was a Belgian-born American historian whose work focused on the history of the Soviet Union. For most of his career, Leopold H. Hameson's career, he taught at Columbia University. Leopold H. Hameson was born in Brussels to Russian emigre parents. In 1940, fleeing the Nazi invasion, the Hameson family escaped first to France and then to the United States where they would settle. Enrolling at Harvard University at the precocious age of 15, by his own admission by lying about his age, he stayed at the same institution until he received his Ph.D. in 1952. He was a member of the faculty of the University of Chicago from 1956. L.H. Hameson joined the faculty at Columbia in 1965 as a professor of Russian history and member of the Russian Institute. Leopold H. Hameson was the director of the Inter-University Project on the History of Bolshevik Movement and a fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. L.H. Hameson published many books and articles specializing in the history of Russia, particularly the Bolshevik movement. And the other person was J.L.H. Keep. It references his book, but it just says, but it doesn't have anything. I can't find any biographical information on him. So it's the end of that footnote. Back to the text. At the International Socialist Congress of 1889, speaking in the name of the Russian socialists, Plekhanov emphatically pronounced the credo of Russian Marxism, quote, the revolutionary movement in Russia will triumph as a workers' movement or will not triumph at all, end quote. The hegemony of the Russian proletariat was the common faith of all the Marxist groups that consequently considered with evident enthusiasm what Peter Struve called the, quote, historical mission of capitalism, end quote, in Russia. They unanimously criticized N.F. Danielson, who believed himself to be loyal to Marx's teaching and rejecting the dogma of, quote, quote, historical necessity, end quote, of capitalism for his country. One might even use Marx's concept of, quote, fetishism, end quote, to qualify this double worship of capitalism as a necessary prerequisite for socialism on the one hand, and of the working class as the guiding force of all the democratic and liberal tendencies in Tsarist Russia on the other. All right, 1 second. The outcome of the February Revolution tested the solidity of this common link between these hostile comrades. Although convinced that Russia was not ripe for a socialist economy and must therefore go through the first stages of capitalist accumulation, both Marxist parties were prepared to participate in the political direction and control of the country in spite of the fact that the peasants constituted the overwhelming majority of the population. From the beginning, both parties had a charismatic conception of the role of the intellectual elite in the Europeanization of Russia. We can see this clearly in the origins of the Russian Social Democratic Party and in the hesitation of the Russian Social Democratic Party's founders to call it a, quote, workers' party, end quote. They could hardly do otherwise, as there was virtually no workers present. The initiative came mainly from the intellectuals who frequently expressed dissatisfaction with the purely, quote, economic, end quote, battles of the Russian workers. In most of the political literature of the 90s, the Russian Marxists stressed the inability of the revered Russian proletariat to see further than their immediate interests, and if Struve drew one set of conclusions from this, becoming a militant liberal, Lenin drew another. In the footsteps of Plekhanov and Axelrod, themselves disciples of Kautsky, Lenin conceived of the party as an elite that embodied a crucial intellectual or scientific mission, to inspire to the workers with a, quote, socialist consciousness, end quote. In the last analysis, the devotion to the proletariat became, for the, quote, scientific socialist, end quote, a narcissistic adoration, and the hegemony of the proletariat became the hegemony, at first intellectual and afterwards political, of the professional revolutionaries. This explains why Axelrod was willing to offer the Democrats and Liberals a provisional alliance to overthrow the autocracy, without disapproving of Lenin's preference for conspiratorial methods and Jacobin centralization of authority. Marx had foreseen that once the alternative of a peasant communal regeneration was lost, Russia would have to experience a bourgeois capitalist revolution, and that whoever was in power during the transitional period would take the required measures to achieve rapid industrial growth by playing the role of the deposed bourgeois class. The Bolsheviks and the other Marxist and non-Marxist groups allied with them acted objectively according to the law of, quote, to the, quote, law of the economic movement of bourgeois society, end quote. One could, therefore, say they were, quote, Marxist, end quote, in the same way they were, quote, Newtonians, end quote, by moving and falling in accord with the law of gravity. Marx was prophetic when he exposed for Mikhailovsky the alternatives mentioned above. But what he could not foresee was that Russia's transformation into a state capitalist nation would be accomplished some 40 years later under the banner of, quote, Marxism, end quote. Yet Marx's Russian followers had less difficulty in learning from his work the methods for building an economy based on the immanent laws of surplus value, that is to say, on capital and wage labor, than they had in learning how to build socialism. But if they could not find in Capital, Marx's Capital, quote, recipes for the kitchens of the future, end quote, they could not ignore that, quote, capital comes to the world sweating blood and filth from all its pores, end quote. Marx's Capital. It was this latter lesson that they put to work. Quote, the political genius of Lenin consisted in giving necessity the aspect of a choice, end quote. Richard Pipes, Max Weber et la Russie. It's a footnote. Mr. Pipes comments on his pessimism with regard to the future of liberalism in Russia. Weber went so far as to doubt whether advanced capitalism in the Western countries had any genuine affinity with democracy and liberty. Likewise, Weber was skeptical of the efforts of, quote, romantic populists, end quote, who glorified the peasant commune in Russia, arguing that on the contrary the Russian peasantry and the Russian petty bourgeoisie were leaning towards an authoritarian regime. End footnote. Without having the same political genius, Stalin applied the concept with the ultimate degree of thoroughness. It is well known that from the moment he returned to Russia after the Revolution of February, Lenin bitterly fought to impose his views on his own party. Quote, A substantial minority, end quote, writes E.H. Carr, quote, if not a majority of the party, seems clearly to have clung to the view, fervently held by Mensheviks and social revolutionaries alike, that the revolution had not yet fully completed its bourgeois stage and was consequently still unripe for its transition to socialism. On this view, the October Revolution was merely a continuation and deepening of the February Revolution and did not differ from it in principle or purpose, end quote. E.H. Carr. E.H. Carr is like a prominent historian of the Soviet Union. I think he initiated like the economic history of the Soviet Union. Anyway, like a in the West at least. February Revolution did not differ from it in principle. Sorry, I already read that. In other words, in seizing power, Lenin. There's a footnote here. Okay, that quote that I just read from E.H. Carr is from the Bolshevik Revolution 1. That's from 1966. In 1918, the left communists were to denounce Lenin's policy as petty bourgeois and capable of leading to a restoration of a capitalist economy. End footnote. In other words, in seizing power, Lenin, his party, and allies only undertook to give body to the promises expressed in his predecessors who proved to be incapable of implementing them. The first instance was achievement of the emancipation of the peasantry, the main gainers of the revolution. It was this accomplishment that from the start impressed on the revolution its bourgeois character. As Rosa Luxemburg rightly noted, quote, if one employs the criteria of Western revolutions, end quote, Lenin said in May 1918, quote, we are now approximately at the level attained in 1793 and 1870, end quote. That's from Lenin, Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government. On Lenin's intellectual development after the October Revolution, see A.G. Meyer, Leninism. Or A.G. Mayer. This is actually what it says. Sorry, I'm looking up A.G. Mayer. I can't really find anything on him. Moving on. End footnote. Where am I? Albert Mathiez, whose history of the French Revolution is tantamount to an apology of Jacobinism, draws a very impressive parallel between Bolshevism and Jacobinism, and gives his argument the following conclusion. Quote, history never repeats itself exactly, but the resemblances that our analysis has shown to exist between the two great crises of 1793 and 1917 are neither superficial nor casual. The Russian revolutionaries copied their French prototypes voluntarily and knowingly. They are animated by the same spirit, ... Times differ. Civilization has marched on for a century and a quarter. But because of Russia's backwardness, Russia resembles illiterate agricultural 18th century France more than is generally believed. It will be interesting to observe and rich material for reflection if the rhythm of the two revolutions follows the same beat until the end. End quote. Albert Mathiez, Le Bolchevisme et le Jacobinisme. English translation by T. Clement in Dissent, Volume 2, Number 1. The Russian Revolution, if you don't know what dissent is, dissent was left, like, social democratic journal, or is a social democratic journal in the United States. The Russian Revolution has often been compared to the French Revolution, particularly by Western Marxists, not to speak of Lenin himself, to mention only one authoritative voice, Karl Kautsky, who first emphasized the Jacobins, and then the beginning of the Stalinist era, the Bonapartist features of the Bolshevik regime. See Von der Diktatur zur Staatssklaverei, 1921, Die Internationale und Sowjetrussland, 1926, and Der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse, 1930. Kautsky's argumentation, particularly in his last writings, incited the criticism of Mensheviks like R. Abramovich, who rejected the Bonapartist parallel. See Revolution, I don't know how to say like revolution and solution or whatever, things that sound like that in German. So, excuse me. See Revolution und Counterrevolution. Das neue Kautsky Buch über Russland, end quote. Die Gesellschaft, number 12, 1930. And wirklicher Bonapartismus zu werden, fällt dem Bolschewismus der kapitalistische Klasseninhalt. And among the Bolsheviks themselves, the above-mentioned parallel has found a competent spokesman in the person of Leon Trotsky, who restricted himself to denouncing the Bonapartist character of Stalin's dictatorship. End footnote. I want to look up Albert Mathiez. Albert Xavier Emile Mathiez, who lived from 1874 to 1932, was a French historian best known for his Marxist interpretation of the French Revolution. Mathiez emphasized class conflict. He argued that the 1789 pitted the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy, and then the Revolution pitted the bourgeoisie against the sans-culottes, who were a proletariat in the making. Mathiez greatly influenced Georges Lefebvre and Albert Soubise in forming what came to be known as the orthodox Marxist interpretation of the Revolution. Mathiez admired Maximilien Robespierre, praised the Reign of Terror, and did not extend complete sympathy to the struggle of the proletariat. So, there you are. End footnote. 50 years have passed since the Revolution, and it does not seem presumptuous to pursue the parallel drawn by Mathiez to our present time. I'm reading outside, and as soon as I start to try to read, it seems like I'm having some kind of allergy issue here. So it'll be a lot of sniffling and probably sneezing and all that, so forgive me. At first, Lenin firmly believed that the bourgeois revolution had ended in April 1917 and that the, quote, socialist revolution, end quote, which in Lenin's view had begun on October 25, 1917, was the most pressing task of the political leaders, the members of the Communist Party, and of all the conscious representatives of the laboring masses. Later, Lenin was more cautious in his diagnosis and confessed that he had, quote, no illusions about the fact that we have only begun the transition period of socialism, end quote. Lenin was also well aware that in Marx's social theory, this, quote, transitional period, end quote, is called capitalism. All the virtues of the capitalist system were proposed as models to builders of socialism. And Lenin was forced to recall the rules of accurate bookkeeping, saving, and good discipline that, quote, proletarian revolutionaries, end quote, had formerly scorned with justification. The realization of these administrative procedures, Lenin declared, is, quote, necessary and sufficient for the triumph of socialism, end quote. Since, quote, the Russian is a poor worker, end quote, the Russian must learn Taylorism, which has Taylorism's virtue in the transition period from capitalism to socialism, Taylorism's barbarous vices being those of bourgeois exploitation. Footnote. In a very, quote, un-Marxist, end quote, way, Lenin restricted the, quote, socialist, end quote, character of the Soviet power in making distinctions between political criterion and the economic one, considering the first a guarantee of the socialist character of the revolution. End footnote. As readers of Capital, the Russian Social Democrats were aware that the first task of the bourgeois revolution is the rapid accumulation of capital. As for the Bolsheviks, they set out to achieve this accumulation from the moment the Bolsheviks assumed power. In addition, once the period of, quote, war communism, end quote, had ended, strict labor discipline, dictatorial factory management, high income differentials, and so on were introduced into Russian society with the aim of attaining the level of development of a capitalist society. Lenin was particularly skillful in masking the economic program of his party by giving its components socialist labels. Hence, what is in fact, on its own Marxist analysis, the transition to highly developed capitalism became, in Lenin's terms, the transition to socialism. In defending the authority given to factory managers, Lenin said, quote, "The irrefutable experience of history proves that ... the dictatorship of revolutionary classes has often been expressed, supported, and carried out by the dictatorship of individual persons," end quote. An important feature of, I would say, all Bolshevik ideology is analogies to bourgeois revolutions. Like ostensibly making socialist revolutions, but as their reference points, constantly drawing on the political features of bourgeois revolutions, right? And just as a side note, if you've listened to any of the things I've put up about third camp Trotskyism, that's one of the main critiques that this bureaucratic collectivists make of Trotsky, amongst others, is his conflation of the character of bourgeois revolutions and socialist revolutions. Whereas bourgeois revolutions posit a firm separation between state and economy, right? So you can have a theoretically fascist dictatorship, but as long as the economy is left to do its own thing in the market form, in left to market mechanisms, you can say that society is still capitalist. When means of production are collectivized, you can't have that automatically, that repoliticizes the economic sphere, and thus, if that sphere, if the politics of society are not democratic, then you cannot say that socialism has been achieved or is in the process of achieving simply on the grounds that property has become collective, or in the sense of statized. That is a very an important thing. So there's this constant conflation of the content of bourgeois revolutions with socialist revolutions that you see that I've seen before in Trotsky, of course, and as pointed out to me by reading through some of the works of the bureaucratic collectivists. And you can see this here with Lenin. The idea that the anti-democratic character of bourgeois revolutions in some way is relevant to the content of a revolution, a type of revolution that at least ostensibly is of a radically different character. I don't know if that made much sense, but it was a thought that I had felt like I had to get out somewhere. Back to the text. Just as in capitalist economy, heavy industry demands the, quote, subordination of thousands of people to the will of a single individual, end quote. In this way, that which Lenin believed to be true of capitalism was grafted onto the practice of Russian, quote, communism, end quote, because the, quote, leaps from capitalism to socialism are so long, end quote. Footnote. When the, quote, left communist, end quote, group reproached Lenin for his, quote, capitulation to the bourgeoisie and its servile petty bourgeois intelligentsia, end quote, and for, quote, making a bugbear of state capitalism, end quote, a, quote, most determined policy of socialization, end quote, Lenin responded that his critics, quote, reveal their petty bourgeois character, end quote, precisely in not understanding, quote, the nature of the transition from capitalism to socialism, end quote. Then Lenin explained the word, quote, transition, end quote. Russian economy contains elements of, quote, both capitalism and socialism, end quote, namely a patriarchal, self-sufficing peasant economy, small commodity production, private capitalism, state capitalism, and finally socialist elements. The Soviet power has nothing to fear from state capitalism because in the Soviet state, quote, the power of the workers and the poor is assured, end quote. Thus, the Bolsheviks' task is to spare no effort in copying the state capitalism of the Germans and, quote, not to shrink from adopting dictatorial methods to hasten the copying of it, end quote. Quote, our task is to do this even more thoroughly than Peter hastened the copying of Western culture by barbarian Russia. And Peter did not hesitate to use barbarous methods in fighting against barbarism, end quote. Lenin. Although petty bourgeois capitalism prevails in Russia, the road to large-scale capitalism leads equally to socialism, quote, through one and the same intermediary station called, quote, national accounting and control of production and distribution, end quote. End quote. Lenin. From, quote, left-wing childishness and the petty bourgeois mentality, end quote. Article published in Pravda, May 9th to 11th, 1918. See Shapiro, L. Shapiro, The Origin of the Communist Autocracy, published in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1955. Finally, it was not the Bolshevik Party, but Lenin in person, or as Lenin seemed to believe, who embodied the will of the proletariat, or as Georg Lukács put it, Lenin was, quote, das zur sichtbaren Gestalt gewordene Klassenbewusstsein des Proletariats, end quote. Lenin. Is there an English translation of that? Oh, just assume I know German. Come on, Max. We're not all worldly and sophisticated like you. I don't know fucking German. Anyway, back to the text, or end footnote. If the historical function of Bolshevism was the accomplishment of industrialization, and therefore the proletarianization of Russia, then what is called, quote, Stalinism, end quote, simply brought this work to its logical conclusion. Lenin created the necessary apparatus and gave it its goals. Stalin used the apparatus most rationally to achieve them. Stalin became the person who embodied the, quote, dictatorship of the revolutionary classes, end quote, but in a way and to a degree that Lenin and the older Bolsheviks were, in the last analysis, too human to foresee. The much heralded transition to socialism in Russia is, in fact, the transition to capitalism in an agrarian pre-industrial country. If it was carried out by party managers coming mainly from the milieu of the Russian bourgeois intelligentsia who considered themselves Marxist, it was because the latter knew what was required for such a transition. This is the starting point from which any concrete analysis of the Russian Revolution and of Russian history since 1917 must proceed. If we accept Marx's approach to the process of economic development, we may say that the function of Lenin, his party, and the bureaucracy was to replace the Russian bourgeoisie, which had to assume the role of creating the material prerequisites of future socialism, that is, a capitalist economy. The Bolsheviks presented their bourgeois Jacobin role in a socialist guise by calling the autocracy of the Bolshevik Party the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, because capital requires ideological means to hide its economic oppression. In Russia, Lenin, his party, and the bureaucracy played the part taken everywhere else by the middle class, and they played it very effectively, too. In speaking of the Bolsheviks carrying through a, quote, bourgeois, end quote, revolution, we mean to emphasize that the necessary framework in which to place their political and economic activities is not a socialist one, but a capitalist one. They have only done for Russia what Marx rightly says was done, in perhaps a less organized way, by capitalists in early years of their domination in all advanced countries. This is particularly true under Stalin's regime and its imitation of highly concentrated Western capitalism. By telescoping both stages of capitalist development as Marx had described them in the 3 volumes of Capital, they jumped quickly from the stage of so-called primitive accumulation to that of enlarged reproduction of capital. This alleged socialist economy of Soviet Russia appears, in fact, as the type of production and distribution process that Marx, particularly in the 3rd book of Capital, treats as managerial capitalism. A form of private capitalism that arises from the expropriation of small-scale enterprises and their absorption by oligopolistic and monopolistic corporations. Managerial capitalism is characterized by Marx as the result of the divorce between the economic function of the capitalist within the production process and his social position as the owner of means of production. In all forms of capitalism, the producer, worker, has no control over the means of production, but on the contrary, participates in the economic process as a mere executant of incontestable orders. The essential relation is one between capital and labor as economic concepts, and only secondarily between individual capitalists and individual workers. It is in this light that capitalism can be said to exist in a society without capitalists, or in terms of a sociological analysis of power relations, in a society where the functions of capitalists in the traditional sense are fulfilled by the, quote, agents, or, quote, managers, end quote, of capital. The basic relation brings together capital, the exploiting capacity of the means of production, and the labor so exploited. Whether the men in control of the means of production are capitalists or managers, as in the West, or communist state bureaucrats and managers, as in the East, is of secondary importance. On one occasion, Marx even spoke of the possibility of all the means of production in a country being owned by one capitalist, or a group of capitalists who could hire managers to do the work of managing. Similarly, Lenin spoke of a, quote, bourgeois state without a bourgeoisie, end quote. Footnote. State and Revolution. There are a few statements in all of Lenin's writings that are more revealing than his claim shortly after the 1905 revolution that the next and successful revolution would result in a, quote, democratic, not a socialist dictatorship, end quote. Quote, such a dictatorship will not be able, without a series of intermediary stages of revolutionary development, to affect the foundation of capitalism. At best, it may bring about a radical redistribution of the land to the advantage of the peasantry, establish consistent and full democracy, including the republic, eliminate all the oppressive features of Asiatic bondage, not only of village but also of factory life, lay the foundation for thorough improvement in the position of the workers and raise their standard of living, and last but not least, carry the revolutionary conflagration into Europe. Such a victory will by no means transform our bourgeois revolution into a socialist revolution. The democratic revolution will not extend beyond the scope of bourgeois social and economic relationships. Nevertheless, the significance of such a victory for the future development of Russia and of the whole world will be immense. End quote. Lenin. The Two Tactics of Social Democracy and the Democratic Revolution, Collected Works 9. Quoting this puzzling, quote, innovation, end quote, in Marxism, J. Plamenats writes, quote, if Marxism were really what Marxists think it is, this suggestion would be so fantastic that we could not believe Marx had made it. If Marxism were a coherent theory and Marxists were persons who believed in it and acted in consequence, Lenin, a real Marxist, if ever there was one, could never have written this absurd and important pamphlet. End quote. German Marxism and Russian Communism, London, 1954. There is another way of looking at these facts. To pretend to be a Marxist and to hold the view Lenin does is equivalent to claiming to be a disciple of Einstein while denying his theory of relativity. End footnote. There was no real effort on the part of Lenin to bolster his new slogan, quote, the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, in a bourgeois revolution and in a capitalist economy, by any reference to quotations from Marx's writings. In fact, Lenin's theoretical, quote, innovation, end quote, in regard to Marx's theory can be considered a reversal of historical materialism that is generally identified by the whole Marxist school with Marx's main contribution to social science. There can be no doubt that Lenin was then aware of the fact that his, quote, slogan, end quote, was an infringement of this theory. In 1917, however, Lenin was apparently happy to discover both the social force which could support his new concept and the literal confirmation he needed, that is, the Soviets and Marx's address on the Commune of 1871. The events of the years following October 1917 revealed that neither the society nor the ideas of Marx on the Paris Commune were suitable to give another character to the development of Russian society and economy than that which Lenin had defined in 1905, namely that of a bourgeois and capitalist society. On the basis of the above-mentioned facts, we may say that the Bolsheviks, in taking power on the behalf of the proletariat in a backward country, played the part that Marx and Engels assigned to the Blanquists in their own time. Bolshevism, ideological distortion of a social theory, which gives maximum credit to the modern class struggle as a dynamic force of social change. Not the parties, but the classes were in Marx's conception the decisive factors of historical change. This ideological distortion was put into effect by the Bolshevik Party by depriving the Soviets of their social and political power and by establishing a dictatorship that, to quote Rosa Luxemburg, was, quote, not the dictatorship of the proletariat, but only the dictatorship of a handful of politicians, that is, dictatorship in the bourgeois sense, in the sense of the rules of the Jacobins, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg, The Russian Revolution. Like almost any other revolutionary, Marx sometimes suffered from fits of impatience that got the better of his intellectual judgment. This is apparent in his support of the Paris Commune only a few months after he had clearly shown why it had to fail. In regard to the revolutionary role of organized minorities, however, he was more consistent, and he never altered his hostile opinion. For Marx, quote, a revolution whose soul is political organizes according to the limited and therefore dual nature of this soul, a dominant sphere of society at the expense of society, end quote. This was his judgment in 1844, and this, we believe, applies to the events of 1917. The social soul of the revolution had been corrupted by its political leaders, who acted as a class of ruling managers quite comparable, from the standpoint of the workers' interests, to the modern managerial ruling class in the Western capitalist countries. When Marx spoke of the methods of primitive accumulation in less developed countries, Marx wrote that they, quote, all employ the power of the state, the concentration and organized force of society, to hasten hothouse fashion the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant of a new one, is itself an economic power, end quote. Marx. Judging from Marx's critical analysis of capitalism and bourgeois society of his time, we may safely assume that the author of Capital would not be misled by the features of our present-day world. The general lesson that can be drawn from the foregoing is that the Russian Revolution of 1917 was not the work of a party guided by a theory or an ideology, but the inevitable result of the whole series of events that preceded it. In this, its history is essentially similar to that of modern bourgeois revolutions, and its subsequent evolution has taken a course similar to that followed by other Western countries, the totalitarian phases of the latter included. With the revolution, Russia entered at last into the process of Western history, and its destiny since then has been inextricably linked with the destiny of the Occident. As Lenin formulated in 1905, quote, Marxists are absolutely convinced of the bourgeois character of the Russian Revolution. What does this mean? It means that the democratic changes in the political regime and the social and economic changes that have become necessary for Russia do not in themselves imply the undermining of capitalism or the undermining of bourgeois domination. On the contrary, they will for the first time properly clear the ground for a wide and rapid European and not Asiatic development of capitalism. They will for the first time make it possible for the bourgeoisie to rule as a class, end quote. Lenin, Two Tactics. The process of transformation and assimilation that was inaugurated in 1917 by the overthrow of the bourgeoisie as a possessing class and by adopting the bourgeois and capitalist methods of economic exploitation and accumulation was long overdue, having been retarded by the heritage of centuries of czarist absolutism. This process is still going on. In short, the Russian Revolution was before all else a necessary result of the facts of Russian history, as was its peculiar course, a course determined by the lack of the enriching Western experience of the Renaissance and the Reformation, and deprived of the development of a powerful urban bourgeoisie struggling for the emancipation of society from the state. No people can sever itself from its past, and historians have therefore often discovered that apparent changes in reality represent new forms of old developments. If this thesis is correct, the problem of parties and ideologies is more approachable, for it implies that the Russian Revolution was as social as well as a political one. As in the Bonapartist Second Empire, the social basis of the new oligarchic power in Russia was represented by a new class of small landowners. Wikipedia says, Second French Empire was an imperial Bonapartist regime of Napoleon III from 14th of January 1852 to the 27th of October 1870 between the Second and Third French Republics. The period was one of significant achievements in infrastructure and economy, while France reasserted itself as the dominant power in Europe. Historians in the 1930s and 1940s often disparaged the Second Empire as a precursor of fascism, but by the late 20th century, it emerged as an example of a modernizing regime. Historians have generally given the Second Empire negative evaluations on its foreign policy and somewhat more positive evaluations of domestic policies, especially after Napoleon III liberalized his rule after 1858. He promoted French business and exports. The greatest achievements included a grand railway network that facilitated commerce and tied the nation together with Paris as its hub. This stimulated economic growth and brought prosperity to most regions of the country. The Second Empire is given high credit for the rebuilding of Paris with broad boulevards, striking public buildings, and elegant residential districts of higher-class Parisians. In internal policy, Napoleon III tried to emulate his uncle Napoleon I, engaging in numerous imperial ventures around the world as well as several wars in Europe. Napoleon III began his reign with French victories in Crimea and in Italy, gaining Savoy and Nice. Using very harsh methods, Napoleon III built up the French Empire in North Africa and in Southeast Asia. Napoleon III also launched an intervention in Mexico, seeking to erect a second Mexican empire and bring it into the French orbit, but this ended in a fiasco. Napoleon III badly mishandled the threat from Prussia, and by the end of his reign, the French emperor found himself without allies in the face of overwhelming German force. His rule was ended during the Franco-Prussian War when he was captured by the Prussian army at Sedan in 1870 and dethroned by French Republicans. He died in exile in 1873 in England. So that's the Bonapartist Second Empire. Back to the text. To be sure, the role of the Bolshevik Party and its ideology is more important than that of the other parties and ideologies, but the Bolshevik Party's and its ideology's importance was subordinate to the process of the revolution, itself the outgrowth of numerous factors. Theoretically or ideologically, both Marxist factions favored a bourgeois revolution, and both were preparing themselves to take charge not only of the subsequent proletarian revolution when it would take place, but also to control the forthcoming preliminary bourgeois stage as well. The fact that one faction, the faction that adopted the name, quote, Bolsheviks, was ready to precipitate a second revolution is less decisive than the common aims and attitudes that united the two. The triumph of Bolshevism was really the triumph of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. This is revealed in the acts of complicity committed by the leftists among the various socialists and Marxist groups during the whole revolutionary period, particularly from the first provisional government to the Bolshevik seizure of power and its aftermath. When Martov, on the eve of the Bolshevik coup d'etat, associated his motion condemning the Bolsheviks in the pre-parliament with two fundamental conditions, immediate land reforms and decisive action to bring about peace, he formulated the main points of the Bolshevik program. Footnote: for a remarkable testimony of the Mensheviks' attitude during the whole revolutionary period, see Theodor Don, The Origins of Bolshevism, and of course, The Standard History of E.H. Carr. End footnote. If the Jacobin elements in Russia finally triumphed over the spontaneously growing movement of the Soviets, it was not because of the genius of Lenin or the virtue of Lenin's party, but rather because of the political immaturity of the Russian people, their pathetic inability to take advantage of the opportunities offered by the decay of Tsarism. But there was nothing in their history that could have given them the necessary capability. If the words, quote, treason, end quote, if the word, quote, treason, end quote, had any place in the vocabulary of historians, we should not look for guilty men or parties, but to history itself, incapable of achieving real human emancipation. The Russian people could only take what was offered. History does not yield messiahs, only managers, though the latter often try to confuse the two. Alright, I gotta go do something. Paradoxical as it may seem, while Russian Marxist ideology has proved a tremendous failure, Marxist social philosophy, or rather sociological interpretation of historical development, has been shown to be amazingly correct. Marx had foreseen the Russian Revolution as a consequence of a war that would take the aspect of a, quote, war of races, end quote, a war in which Germany would fight, quote, against combined Slavic and Roman races, end quote. Footnote: Karl Marx's Second Manifesto of the General Council of the International Workingmen's Association, September 9, 1870. End footnote: the strange alliance between Republican France, the heir of the Great Revolution, and Tsarist Russia, the bastion of European reaction, was in itself of the highest prophetic significance. Russia was thus drawn into the historical destiny of Occidental civilization as much as by her military alliance with France as by her military defeat and the resulting inevitable revolution. Furthermore, Marx predicted the social character of this revolution, the transformation of Russia from a rural semi-Asiatic society to a modern or urban proletarian society. Can we speak here of a bourgeois society? Yes and no. Yes, if we do not identify the bourgeois regime with liberalism, because bourgeois regimes may be totalitarian in their various forms, Bonapartism, fascism, Nazism, and if we consider the evolution of the traditional individualistic phase of the bourgeoisie to the bureaucratic or managerial stage. No, if we think of the bourgeoisie in terms of individual capitalists. What Marx could not have foreseen was that the political masters of the Russian Revolution would claim to have acted in accordance with his social theory, that is, with the materialist conception of history, nor could Marx have imagined that this revolutionary creation of a proletarian society and a state capitalist economy would be proclaimed by the ruling class as a socialist revolution and be accepted as such by Western scholars, oblivious of the facts that in a class society, quote, the ruling class are the ideas, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, end quote. Marx Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels Communist Manifesto. History sometimes makes for strange bedfellows, and such phenomena have been ranged under the highly unscientific idea of, quote, the irony of history, end quote. The year 1967 is one of such an iconic coincidence. The 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution is celebrated in the same year as the 100th anniversary of the publication of Capital. It would cause no surprise that the ruling party in Russia, in celebrating these two anniversaries, should deliberately link the two together, In so doing, it would not realize how profoundly right it would be. After 50 years of managerial rule, the Bolsheviks and their allies may be aware of the fact that if capital has not offered them, quote, recipes for the kitchens of the future, end quote, Capital, the book, still may present an almost accurate description of their own adventures. Thus, contrary to Marx's expectations, quote, Oriental despotism, end quote, is undertaking the historical mission that Occidental capitalism has failed to achieve. One second. Let's see how long this thing is. Okay, well, that's the end. There's a response to this by Shlomo Avineri, but it's too long for me to just attach to this video. That'll be best as a separate video. So I thank you for listening.